All right. Good morning, everyone. My name's Dan Laird. I am the administrator for Panopto on campus. I was hoping that prior to today, I would get a test course in Brightspace, but one hasn't been set up for me yet. So um, I'm going to go through what this looks like in Blackboard. I am pretty sure that how this will look in Brightspace will be almost exactly the same, because it's pretty much just a window into Panopto for both systems. So you're probably going to see the same thing in each system. I haven't verified that yet, but that's usually how these software packages work. So I'm going to go through this, showing you what it looks like through Blackboard, and it should be very similar to whatever you see in Brightspace. Unfortunately, I don't have any instructions on how to set it up in Brightspace because I haven't been able to play with it yet. So I don't know. I'm expecting it to be, again, about the same as it would be in Blackboard, which was a couple mouse clicks. It wasn't anything um, terribly difficult to set up Panopto. So once I get that information, we'll be sure to get that out to you, but I don't have it right now. So I do apologize for that. Our CTS has been working really hard to get everybody set up in Brightspace. So I'm kind of on the back burner, which is fine because I'm not teaching in Brightspace, so I am not a priority to SUNY at the moment. So um, I'm just going to go through this how I normally would, and if any of you have any questions, I'll be sure to try to answer them the best I can. And if you have any specific stuff that I have to get back to you on, then I'll work on it and let you know. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So this is my test course in Blackboard. And typically, I believe it'll be the same heading, but in here on the menu of every new Blackboard course, there was a class recordings tab. Something similar will be in Brightspace, and you would click on that, and it would say, click here to provision your course with Panopto. So it was a couple mouse clicks, and that's the first step, is to set this up in the LMS, because what that does, it gives you access, that will create an account with Panopto, and it will also give the students that are registered in that course viewer access to whatever you post to that course. So it kind of takes care of creating the account for you and then setting all the permissions so that everything works right. And as the year progresses and you have people added and dropped from the course, it'll update dynamically. So you don't need to worry about, new students not having access. It'll automatically be done in the system. So this is sort of what it's going to look like. As you publish content, you can have it show up in your course like these. These are the links to videos that I've done in Panopto. The first thing you're going to want to do, if you're not teaching in a classroom on campus, those all have Panopto on the podium computers. So if you are teaching on campus and want to use Panopto to record your lectures, then you would go onto the computer at the front of the class, open Panopto, and then start recording from there. I'm gonna assume it's probably 50-50 with the audience that I have with this video. So you might want to use this to supplement materials on an online course or a hybrid course, and this works perfectly well with that use case as well. So the first thing you're going to want to do is download Panopto. So once you have it set up in Brightspace or Blackboard or whatever you're using, there's this green create button, and you click on the record an application option right here. So what that does is it opens Panopto on your computer. If you don't have Panopto on your computer, it will see that and be like, hey, do you want to download Panopto? So this is the easiest way. There's also, no, actually that is the easiest way to do it. Click on this. If you don't have Panopto already, it will prompt you to install it. So you download the installer, take care of that. And then this is what it should do. You should get a button that says Launch Panopto. Right here, you can see where you can download it. If you have a Windows machine, you'll want to do the 64-bit one most likely. And for the Mac OS, there's a version for that as well. So I am going to pretend that I clicked launch, and I'm going to switch my share. So let's see, to the Panopto window. Okay. So this is what the recorder looks like. There's a few things that I want to show you that are important in here. You can set up your video, which is just your webcam. Unfortunately, I can't right now. Zoom is using my camera, so I can't show you what it would look like in here because two applications can't share a camera. So one thing to note, if you are using Zoom and Panopto, they can't share resources, so it has to be one or the other. So let's see here. The microphone, as you can see here, these levels move as I talk. You're going to want to make sure that that is present, like do a test before you start your recording, just so you can see that the levels are there. Audio is the most important, one of the most important components of this, because without you talking with the screen capture, it's kind of useless. So I want to make sure that at the very least the microphone's working. So, and you want to verify up here where the folder is that this is going to the course that you want the content to go to. If you have multiple courses, when you click on this pull down, it'll give you a selection of courses that you have set up in Panopto. And by default, the name of your video is a timestamp. Some faculty would like to put in the chapter of the book that they're teaching from as their title for that particular lecture, or you can change it to whatever you feel like, but that's what I see quite often. So, and by default, the screen capture isn't, the preview isn't set up. But what this does, besides recording your voice, and if you have a webcam, you talking, it also captures whatever's on your screen. So if you have a PowerPoint, Google Slides, if you are presenting something that's in YouTube or something that's in a browser, you can move about however you would in front of a classroom, like going from program to program, talking about what you want to in the class. This will record every single thing that you've done on the screen. So it'll be you talking over a screen capture pretty much. If by chance you are in a classroom and you want to use one of the document cameras, we highly recommend that. Unfortunately, with the cameras that we have on campus, they don't catch what's written on a whiteboard very well. Some people still do it, but it doesn't show up very well. The camera quality isn't quite there, unfortunately. So we encourage people that are teaching on campus, if you have any written work that you would like to share in the video, to use the document cameras that are in the classrooms. If you do that, there's a secondary sources section right here. If you click add another video source, in this pull down, there'll be an entry for the document cam. So that document camera feed will be a secondary, will be recorded along with your screen capture and you talking. So there'll be two video feeds in your video, one for the document camera, actually three. One for the document camera, one for the screen capture, and then you talking if you so choose in the video feed. So that's the basics of what to look at and how to set up the Panopto recording before you hit record. Does anyone have any questions so far? I don't know. Hopefully I'm not going too fast.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Let's see. I'll turn my camera on here. So I was trying to use this the other day, and I'm a beginner, so I have it downloaded and I can get into it, but
Okay.
I was having a problem, like, and maybe, how do I load the PowerPoint? So I see, maybe I didn't miss, maybe I see up top here, there's two different tabs. So like I had the PowerPoint on my computer,
Right.
and I wanted to like show me talking through the PowerPoint, and I couldn't figure out how to load the PowerPoint.
Did you have PowerPoint open? I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all
Like I
you have
had a
to do.
PowerPoint.
All you have
Do
to
you have to
have.
click maybe up top where it says PowerPoint and main screen? Maybe that's what I didn't see, and I needed, do
Nope.
I need to know?
You don't even need to do that. As long as you have PowerPoint on your screen, it'll record it. And also, if you have PowerPoint open, Panopto will grab a copy of that PowerPoint as well. It does a couple different extra things when you use PowerPoint, which are pretty cool. It will scrape the screen. It will make all the text that you have in your PowerPoint searchable when a student is watching. So this actually works the best with a PowerPoint presentation because it does a couple extra things it doesn't do with other things. So as long as you have PowerPoint open and on the screen, that's all you need to do. You don't need to do anything special.
Okay, I don't know. I'll have to play around with it again, and then if I can't get it to work, I'm gonna write your name down here.
Sure. Yep. All you need to do is have PowerPoint open and maximized on your screen when you're presenting. That's all you need to do. There's
Okay.
Yeah.
Would it be behind this though? So like I'm in here doing this, and now PowerPoint is somewhere, right? Behind, well,
You
I
do
don't know,
have
on
to
this
have
card.
PowerPoint on your main screen for it to be captured. If you only
Okay.
have one screen, then it will definitely be captured, as long as you have it maximized and are going through the slides while you're talking.
And I would see it right here where it's like, would I see the PowerPoint right here in this black space where it's showing screen capture in progress?
Not unless you click on this.
It's like,
By default, the preview is disabled. So you'd have to click this button right here to see what is on your screen.
all right, it's confusing, I guess, because, okay, so I'm in Blackboard and I'm like doing this Panopto stuff. My PowerPoint is technically hidden because I'm on Blackboard. So I got to go to it.
Yeah, you have to maximize PowerPoint over whatever other windows you have open. So you got to minimize, either you minimize your other browsers or open up PowerPoint and make it maximize on your screen.
Okay, so I would come in here, check off these boxes, and then hit record, and then minimize this, and my PowerPoint would be my main screen, and I would just know that it's working. I don't see, like, I don't actually see myself talking and going through it.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, Panopto is running in the background. So you open up your PowerPoint, present what you would present, and then when you're done with the PowerPoint, minimize it, close it, whatever you want to do, and then stop the recording in the Panopto window.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. It's just like what you would do if you were in front of a class. Like you just bring up what you would want to be talking about in the main window, talk over it, and then when you're done, go back to the Panopto window and click the stop button. So.
Okay.
Dan, this is Rebecca. I just have a quick follow-up question related, I think. So I'm really excited that the machine will scrape the PowerPoints and make that searchable. That seems incredibly helpful and wonderful. Is that also true if you're working from a Mac or only from a Windows machine?
If you're using PowerPoint on either platform, it'll work.
That's really fantastic. And then I'm not totally sure I'm understanding. So these secondary sources where you can check what the recording is going to record, right? So if you check the capture PowerPoint and capture main screen, and at my house, if I'm doing this at home, I actually do have a second screen, right? Like I plug my laptop into this secondary screen. I like to put my PowerPoint on my little screen. And then normally I have my Zoom or my whatever other windows I need on my other big screen, right? So if I check those boxes, it's going to record all of those things. does that mean, maybe you're just going to get there, but like later, does it mean that I have to choose which of those streams to focus on in every like section of the video? Or how is it going to balance all of those simultaneous focuses of attention in the video that it broadcasts to the students later?
So I will go over that, but if there's do you want both screens captured?
No, but I can think of like certain exercises where it could be really great, actually, right? Like if they have like the slide I'm talking about plus like an image, say, right, on a different screen, right? And they could have like, but I just don't know, like, does it do like a pop-in window? Does it put it side by side? Like, and then they don't need me as the talking head with an image all the time, but
Yeah.
can I like show them those two things? Like, here's a list of stuff and here's like an image we're working with or something here, right? And
Right.
then, yeah.
In the playback, they can control what screens they watch in the main viewer, and they can kind of switch windows around. I'll show you. But
Okay.
if it were me, I think I would stick with one screen just to keep it less complicated, and then move what I want to be recorded into the main screen that is being recorded. Like, say, if I was doing a PowerPoint and I wanted to bring up a JPEG of a picture of something, I
Mhm.
would open that in that screen and
On the
have it.
screen, that's the main.
Yeah, it would just make it easier for students. I mean, if you're doing two different things side by side, like I said, with a document camera and a
Mhm.
PowerPoint, that would make sense. But if you're kind of just doing something for a few minutes, like, it would be better to just do it in the main screen and not have two feeds being recorded. So that's how
Right.
I would do it. I mean,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'll go
I have
over.
another.
Yeah, go ahead.
Will it show me, like if the professor wants them to see them talking, will they see me?
Yes, by default, you will be seen.
So they'll see the main PowerPoint and then I'm like off to the side or something?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, I just gotta practice.
I'll show you what the playback looks like in a little bit.
Okay,
So
perfect.
you'll get to see that.
Okay.
And if anybody, for whatever reason, doesn't want to be recorded, you can set the video to none, and there just won't be a feed for it, and your screen capture will take up the whole screen. So there won't be a little side window with you talking. So. Okay, any other questions before I move on? Okay, so say you're happy with how everything is set up. So what I'm going to do is click record. So normally when you click record, I would minimize this window and then open up my presentation or whatever I was going to talk about for my video, do my lecture, and then when I'm finished, I would come back to my Panopto window and click the stop button. So that says that the recording's complete. This is the name if you want to change it. This will give you one last chance to do so. You can enter a description if you want. If you say you're recording this at your desk and you weren't happy with it and you want to do it again, you can click the delete and record again. I'm happy with what I did, so I'm going to click done. So this is uploading. It's going to be real quick because that was a 30-second video. So that was like, normally with most people for a typical course, it's around 45 minutes to an hour. So that will take a little bit longer. So what that did was it uploaded this recording to Panopto. And once it gets there, it needs to be processed and then it'll be available for your course. This was really quick. Holy cow. Normally, even with a small video, it'll take a couple minutes to be rendered on the server, but it looks like it's ready. So let me see. So I'm going to go back to my Blackboard window. And I'm going to refresh that. I would refresh that if the refresh button's being covered by Zoom. There it is. So the video that I just made was published to my course. Here's the link for it. Here's a little thumbnail that shows a preview of it. and everything that's published to your course will be captioned. You can see in these other videos, there's this little CC window. So everything's machine captioned. The accuracy is pretty good. It's in the mid 90% area, but you're going to want to go back in and make sure that, there's no mistakes, because there probably will be. I'll show you. You can see right here, it's embedding captions right now. So I'll go into how to look at the captioning a little bit later. But for now, I just wanted to show you, when you get done with your presentation and complete it, and you're happy with it, you click OK. It will upload it to Panopto and then publish a link to your course. If there, for some reason, you want to do content that isn't immediately available to your students, say you want to, make a series of videos that you want available throughout the semester, you can set up a schedule for those to get published. I'll show you that in the folder options, but just to let you know, if you're not comfortable with things being immediately published, there's a way to hold them up so that you can edit them or just wait for them to be available, depending on whatever you want your schedule to be. So, but by default, everything that you publish to your course will immediately become available in the LMS, Brightspace, Blackboard, whatever that may be. So, any questions with the upload process before I move on?
I have one, I guess one just question. So once they're all like, if you do a bunch of videos, they're all here and wherever we are right now, Panopto content or somewhere. Then like, let's say on the left of my screen, usually I have like under the learning modules, I would have like module 1, module 2, all the way down to module 15.
Yep.
And maybe one of these videos is going into each one of those modules. Then you can just somehow like just move it.
Inside the content creation in the LMS, there's like a mashup button, I believe. You can go in there and there's a Panopto video button, and you click on it and it'll show you the videos available to the course, and you can publish those in your content areas. So
okay,
I'm assuming that the editor in Brightspace will be similar to the one in Panopto or in Blackboard. So it's pretty easy to embed content into your folders on the side. So a lot of people.
Okay.
So. Okay. All right. So you've got your videos.
I'm sorry. Did you answer my question in the chat room? I had to run to the restroom for a moment.
No, sorry. I didn't know there was anything in the chat. Hang on. It's possible for the video to go to a personal computer instead of the cloud. Yes. You can publish these offline. So let me go back. I'll change my share and I'll get to the other questions. Sorry, I didn't know those were in there. New share. Okay. So if you go to your create new recording, under folder, there's this offline recording button. So if you click that, record and stop your video once you stopped and you're happy with it, and it will save it locally. And then that video will also show up under your recordings in here. There's an uploaded recording setting, and then there'll be like an offline recording. So you can save those locally. If you do that, I don't know if you have the same abilities to edit it and mess around with it like you would if it was uploaded to the server. So, but you can save them locally. Let me look at the other questions. I'm sorry if I see. Judith, this should be the same on all the devices we use. So the recorder and the content window will look the same regardless if you're on a Mac or a PC. There is a mobile app, but that's more, I mean, you can record with it, but it's more for playback for students. I would recommend, sticking to a desktop version if you're going to be creating content. You can create content with a tablet and a mobile device. It's possible, but the experience is a little easier with a desktop or a laptop computer. So I think I answered your questions, Michelle, about PowerPoints. And I answered your question, Rebecca. Okay, cool. Just making sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, let me go back into the content window. Okay. So once you've got your videos in here, you can, I'm going to show you the options for the videos first, and then we'll go into what the playback looks like for students. So under these, as you hover over them, you'll see a settings, a share, an edit, stats, and a delete. The settings, you can mess around with exporting it. You can copy it to other courses. I'll go through, I'm just giving you a high level overview right now. The share, you can share these outside of your class if you so chose, like if you wanted to share it with a colleague or a student that's not in the course or anybody, for whatever reason, you can share these videos out from here. The edit button, there's an online editor that I'll go through quickly. It's very simple. It can't do a lot of things, but it can cut and paste. So if you want to say remove a portion of your video and not make it available because either maybe it was dead space and you were doing group work and it doesn't really help with the published product, or there's a conversation that you just don't want to be included, you can edit that out. So I'll show you that. That's also where you edit the captions that are generated. The stats, you can go in and see who's viewed your videos and for how long. There's also heat maps that show like what portions of the video are looked at most. So say, there's a subject within a certain lecture that people are keying in on. You can kind of see where people are going to in the video and like where the most popular spots of the video are. So it's useful data. So first I'll show you the settings. So in here, you can, there might be a few more of these. I think this is pretty much what you see. I don't think me being an administrator makes it look different. You can change the folder that it's in. You can change the name. You can change what the thumbnail is. You can also, this is where you do the availability. So you can set the availability either per video or on the folder. So if you didn't want your videos to be published immediately, this is where you would go. By default, on all folders that are created in Panopto, the session becomes available immediately. So this is something you would need to change if you wanted it not to be that way. Say I just wanted this video to be the only one in my folder that I didn't want available. I could click on this and say, I would like this to be available on Monday at 10 o'clock. And that way no one will be able to see it in the feed until then, except for you, since you're the creator. But all viewers in this folder wouldn't be able to see it until that time. And then you can also have it so it becomes unavailable for whatever reason. Say you only wanted it available for a week, you could do that if you wanted to. So those are the most used options in here. Besides, let's see. If you go to manage, I believe you can copy a lot of faculty will copy videos from semester to semester. So you can copy existing videos to new folders. So this is where you would go to do that. So you can name it something new. Otherwise, it'll just append this copy at the end, and then you can select which folder you would like to copy it to. So. Okay, and those are the main points in the settings. Share. This kind of shows you by default, like I said, your students will be will be in this viewer category for this course shell. So by default, a group is created and all the students for that course will be put into that group and be given viewer access. So they'll show up in here. But if for whatever reason, you wanted to make this video available outside of Panopto, you click on who can access this video. You can make it public to SUNY Oswego, which is our organization. If you do this, just so you're aware, if you do make it available to everyone and you don't put it unlisted, then other people will see it in their results when they open Panopto sometimes. And it causes some confusion because some people will see other people's videos and they're like, oh my God, is my stuff available to everyone else too? If you see other people's videos available in your search, that means that they made them available. It's not because your stuff is public. So don't worry. If you see another instructor's videos, it's because they shared it with everybody. So I get that question a lot. So if you wanted to make it public, you can do so. Say you wanted to share it out on a web page. Like if you had a blog or just a personal website that you wanted to share the content you make, you can do that by making it public. So there's a couple different options for sharing if you chose to do so. And there's some other social media ones in here too for Facebook and Twitter. And if you're going to be doing this into a web page, this is the embed code that you can kind of monkey around with and create different code. So, okay. Just stop for a quick moment. Any questions before I move on to some other options in the folder?
I guess, yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
So the standard for this is that it's when you were in those settings there, it's basically locked, so nobody can see it until you give other people permission, right?
Exactly.
And I saw a thing where it said like copy the link, and I think that's what I did because I made one of these videos and it was just me talking for a few minutes. And
Right.
I just like copied the link and then I posted it into my module. So that's like another way. That's a way to do it.
You could
Okay,
definitely
perfect. Just to make sure. Yeah,
Yep.
okay.
If you wanted to just copy the link out of this and then put it wherever you want in your content, you can do that too. So
That means anybody can see. If I've posted into the module, they can see it, right?
that anybody in the
No.
course can see it.
In the
So if
course,
you-
right? Okay.
Yep. If all you do is copy the link and put it into another section of the LMS in your class, then only your class is going to be able to see it. The only way this will change is if you click on this change button and make it something other than it already is. It's always going to be restricted only to specific people and groups unless you change it. So.
And that restriction to specific people and groups means the people that are in that current class.
Yep.
So when my class gets copied and pasted over for the future, for like, let's say for fall,
Right.
now only the fall class will be able to see it, right?
Correct.
The fall class will still have access to it.
Right? Any content you copy over from a previous class will be automatically given permission to the current students of whatever new course that you're moving into.
Right. Awesome. Okay. This is great. I'm learning so much. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Dan,
Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry, Dan, as you transition, how long will Panopto keep our videos?
That's a very good question. So up until January, we had unlimited space. Now we've been told by Panopto that we no longer have unlimited space. We're creating a retention policy right now, and we haven't presented it to the campus yet. But what it's basically going to look like is any content that hasn't been viewed in over 2 years is going to be put into what's called an archive. And the archive is disk space that is not immediately available to students and faculty. It's pretty much taking something and storing it offsite. And it takes 24 hours for it to be retrieved digitally. So if you have current content that you've used over the past couple years, you're not going to have to worry about it. That's going to be an active space. And if it's being used, then the system will see that and it won't archive it. We're just getting into this. So some details of this might change, but for right now, we're looking at anything older that has been viewed in over 2 years will be archived. So,
Okay, so we're rolling 2 years and it'll sort of get moved like off-site, but then we can pull it back with enough advance notice.
Yep. It's we have, I think we're going to have 50,000 hours of archive, and we have about 10,000 hours of current storage. So we have to walk this line of making sure we don't go over 10,000. And we're going to be, we haven't purged anything from the system since we got it in 2012. So there's going to be a lot of content that hasn't been used in a while that's going to bring our numbers down. So we haven't really gotten to that point yet. So this is all preliminary, but eventually there's going to be archive hours that we're going to have to put old material into that isn't getting rid of your material. It's the analogy they give me from Panopto is it's like taking something from your fridge and putting it in the freezer. So it takes a day to thaw out when you take it back out of the freezer. So
which is different than when like the mob is like put him on ice, right? Like that's not
Right.
what we're talking about. Okay.
Right.
That's good. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, no problem.
So I have a follow-up to that too.
Yeah, sure.
So, okay, so in terms of us and our classes, like let's say we have, an hour video or something in each week. So I have 15 hours worth of video on my class, and I'm going to copy and paste it potentially for a few semesters until I have to go back and edit it and change it or whatever. But all my copied stuff, it'll always be there and I won't have any problems with that.
Right. Your copies, if you have a copy in an old, like say you have a folder from 2019, and even if it's stuff that you've copied to a newer course, the older stuff will get archived. So yeah, if it's something that hasn't been viewed in over 2 years, regardless of if a copy of it somewhere else is being viewed, the older copy will be archived. So
but if my students are constantly viewing this stuff every semester, it'll be okay.
Yep. Yeah, it looks at the algorithm on the files to see what's been viewed, and if anything is current and is content that's being used, it won't get archived. So.
Okay.
Would it be possible to bypass that by downloading the videos onto a personal computer and then re-uploading them onto Panopto, or would they still catch that and archive videos that haven't been watched?
I don't know. I guess in theory, if you were to export a video and re-upload it to Panopto and that would get logged as being viewed, then that would bypass the retention policy. But I'm guessing because I don't know that answer for sure. So yeah, don't worry too much about current content and the space that it takes up. But if you have old content that's hanging around that you haven't used in a while, that should get archived, because we're paying a lot of money for the storage that we have, and it wouldn't be a good idea to keep stuff that doesn't need to be in archive. But yeah, just on a side note to that, you can export videos from Panopto and put them on a personal drive or on your hard drive if you so choose. Let's see. It's under outputs. Yes. So under the settings tab, there's a video podcast. By default, it does a picture in picture. which has, I don't know how well you can see the thumbnail, but your talking head will be down in the lower right, and then the rest of the window will be your screen capture. By default, that's what it is. And if that was perfectly fine for you, you can click the download podcast, and that will download, I believe, an MP4 of this video. You can change this. Say you just wanted the screen capture and not a window of you talking in the video. This would just be a recording of you talking over your screen capture. So that might be preferable because you might not want your talking head obscuring your a corner of your PowerPoint presentation. You might that might be going over some content that's in your slides. So just so you know, that's, you can mess around with this. And like, say you had a guest speaker and all you wanted was somebody, like the video of the person talking, then it would be primary video, because that's considered primary, and only the talking head would take up the screen. So you can mess around with this. You can do side by side. But those are the most used forms of downloaded videos. So you can also have an audio only copy if you wanted to. That's down here as well. Good questions. Sure. Okay. So how much time? I'm running out of time. Okay. Let me show you the editor real quick. Like I said, this isn't very robust. Doesn't have a lot going on. Down here, you'll see this S1. That is the screen capture. That's the secondary feed. The primary feed is the audio. So you can kind of see like the audio up here. So say you wanted to edit out like the first 10 minutes or like the first 5 minutes of your class because you hit record and there's still conversation going on and you hadn't started the lecture yet. You can drag this border out as far as you would like. Say I want the first 10 seconds edited out. So what this will do, if I click this apply button up here, it will make the first 10 seconds unavailable for playback. So usually the main edits that people would like to do is like trimming the beginning or the end. So they make this very easy to do. So I can also trim the end the same way. So say I wanted to get rid of the last 5 seconds, that's how I would do it. And then I would click apply up here. And I don't want to close the editor because I'm not done. So what that will do is it doesn't delete those portions of the video that you grayed out. It only makes them unavailable for playback. So say for some reason, like you wanted to go back and be like, hey, I trimmed too much. I just want to adjust this again. You can move it back. That content has not been deleted. It's still there. So you can still edit it. So.
And
the
Dan,
other, yes.
Sorry, in the lower, the little scissors, the little green scissors right above
Yep.
where you were moving does that delete it?
Nope.
Oh, good.
Those, if you click on that, that will enable you to grab a portion in the middle. So I was showing you just how you could drag out from the edges. If you click the green scissors button, that will enable you to select a portion within the video.
Gotcha.
And then, yeah, there's no way it will not let you delete content from a video.
Okay.
It will only let you gray it out so it's not available. I think the term is non-destructive edits.
So this is great though, because then if you are making a video and you have a little slip up, maybe just pause, redo that little section again, and then carry on instead of like stopping and starting the whole thing from fresh, right? Because you can go back and edit out your slip up.
Yep.
And it'll just keep running.
Yep.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so besides these edits, I want to note with all of you, this is where you go to change, to edit captions. So these are the captions that it created for me. So if I wanted to listen and edit these, say I didn't say this word, you can just go in here and edit it and then hit return, and that'll make the change. You can also enter your own captions, but since the system generates them, all you got to really do is go in here and edit what it's made for you. So you can also import caption files. This works really well. So I recommend people let the system create captions for you and then go in and edit them afterwards. It does a pretty good job with it. So those are the main points of the editor. I've got, let's see, I think I've got 8 minutes. Any other questions with the editor before I move on? Apply my changes and close the editor. All right, so it's going to say this session's being processed. So every time you make a change, it's pretty much being resent to the server so that it can be coded, and then the process be redone and then be posted again. So it won't be available for a short period of time if you make those edits. So you can see right here, it says processing podcast. So it's processing the changes that I made. I'm just going to click on this older video to show you what the playback looks like, because I know we had a few questions related to that. So recording. Actually, there's no PowerPoint in this, so I can't show you, but I'll just go over this real quick. So as we were talking about, if you had multiple windows, you can see right here, like this is the video of me talking, and this is the video of the screen capture. If I wanted for some, like if I'm the student and there wasn't anything interesting on the screen and I just wanted to listen to the professor talk, I could maximize or make that the main portion. I could make full screen that if I wanted to. So the students have the ability to change which feeds they're looking at and which window. If you had a third feed, like we were talking about, if you had a document camera, or you wanted to share a second screen, there would be down here in this the playback, where the play button is, and the timeline and the volume. Down here, there would be a button that you could switch between feeds. So you can switch to see different video feeds in this window. So they can advance through, they can search the recording. So besides the being able to search the content in the PowerPoints, this also makes your spoken word searchable. So say, let's see, so this gives me each instance that I said the word video in this video. So like I said, not only does you can search the content, you can also search the spoken word, which is really cool. So that's something that became available not too long ago. But your captions have to be accurate. So it's kind of, on us to go in and, make sure that what's in here is actually what we said. And I think, does anybody have any other questions about the playback? You can also there's a caption button down here. It will progress. I don't know if you've seen like LinkedIn Learning or there's some other places that when a video is playing, it will highlight what's being said over here in the captions. They can also view it in the window like, traditional closed captioning is. So. Okay. Any questions with the playback? Okay. The last thing I'm going to show you is the stats. And my content doesn't have any stats because nobody's looking at it. But if it did, oh, I guess, yeah, me looking at it showed up. So this will show how many times it's been viewed, the number of people that have viewed. So unique viewers is the actual number of viewers. Views and downloads is the total number of times it's been viewed. Unique viewers is how many people. How many minutes have been watched, the duration of the video, and then the average completion percentage, like how much of a video is watched on average. So you can customize the period of time that you want this data for. You can also see the viewer engagement. And then say you have a student that is telling you, I've been watching your videos and I'm still, if for some reason you wanted to see actually how much a student is watching, you can go down and it will show how many times that student has engaged with your content. So it'll show how many times they've watched it and the duration. And so
Dan,
this is
about
all-
that,
What's that?
if a student were to download the video and watch it in some other application, right? Like in Apple, I don't even know what, in like
Right,
VLC or something like this, right? All I can see then is that they downloaded it. I can't actually from these metrics see if they watched it. Is that true?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
So you can look at this by video. The analytics are also available on the folder. So you can get like a high level overview of all your videos performance. Of course, there's not going to be any because.
So when we watch our own videos, that doesn't count towards the statistics, does it?
Yes, it does. Because I
Would
watched.
that also help with the whole, nobody's watched this for 2 years, so we're going to delete it thing that's going on?
I don't, it probably will. I'm assuming that faculty views will count as much as student views. So a view is a view according to the system. So that's kind of a high level overview of everything. I think that's most of what. One other thing that might be helpful. Oh, this didn't do something. Okay, hang on, let me refresh. I've got 1 minute left. All right. So one other thing you can do, this box with the arrow, this will open up the window in Panopto. So this will take the content outside of your LMS and open in a larger window, so you'll be able to see things a little bit better. It kind of opens it in its own web page, so that might be useful to some of you. So anything else before I get cut off?
What about webcasting and students watching virtually because they're sick or at home?
You can do webcasting. I know a few people that have done this kind of like the weeks that a lot of students leave, like for Thanksgiving break. A lot of people will ask for it to be available virtually. Zoom is more as a superior webcasting product to this. We kind of recommend people don't use this for webcasting. But if you are going to, let me go back to the Panopto window. Okay, there's this webcast button right here. You click on that and that will broadcast this. It'll put a link in your folder on the LMS that will be you talking live. There's a delay. So the reason we kind of shy people away from using this for webcasting, if you want to have interaction with your audience, it doesn't work that well because there's a delay. But if you just like say you had a guest speaker or you didn't care about, interacting with the audience, that option would be perfectly fine. But that's the downside of using it for that.
So would you recommend that we record on Zoom and then upload into Panopto afterwards?
Yes. If you're teaching class through Zoom, then I would recommend you take those recordings and put them into Panopto afterwards, and then move them around as you see fit, whatever purpose you want to use them for.
And there won't be any discrepancies with like multiple sources, like screen sharing versus integrated webcam versus PowerPoint or anything like that?
Nope. Nope. They're each one is its own feed, except for the PowerPoint. It shows up on the screen capture, so that's kind of the same thing. So.
When you record on Panopto or Zoom or really any online device, do you have to worry about copyright protection when it comes to material from the textbook that you're projecting onto the main page?
I've never come across that. No. As long as it's being used within your course and it's not, being published out for any sort of for-profit venture, then yeah, if it's course content, then you're good. It's not, it doesn't do like a search like something like YouTube would for copyrighted material. It's,